Get away from my engine, boy! Colonel Victoria Sterling's voice thundered through Fort Braxton's hangar as she stormed toward Darius Thompson. The 22-year-old black recruit stepped back from the smoking F-35, tools still in his hands. What makes you think you can touch a $30 million jet? Sterling's polished boots stopped inches from his worn ones. This isn't your neighborhood garage. Darius held his ground despite 40 personnel watching. Ma'am, I heard something unusual in the engine before it failed. You heard something? Sterling's laugh was razor sharp. Listen carefully, recruit. Fix this engine and I'll marry you myself. But since that's impossible, grab that rag and clean my boots instead. The hangar fell silent except for cooling metal. NATO officials would arrive in 18 hours. Billions hung in the balance. Sterling had no idea she'd just made a promise that would destroy her career. Fort Braxton wasn't just any military installation. Nestled in the rolling hills of North Carolina, it housed the most advanced fighter jet training program in the world. The F-35 Lightning II facility represented the pinnacle of American military aviation technology. Today, that reputation was hung by a thread. The crisis had begun 6 hours earlier during a routine training flight. Captain Sarah Martinez had been conducting standard maneuvers when the F-35's engine suddenly lost power at 15,000 feet. She'd managed an emergency landing, but the jet that rolled into the hangar was essentially a $30 million paperweight. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the base's head mechanic with 20 years of experience, had run every diagnostic in the book. Computer screens displayed endless streams of error codes, but none pointed to a clear solution. The engine showed no obvious damage, no visible leaks, no burned components. It simply refused to start. This doesn't make sense, Rodriguez muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. All systems check out, but she won't even turn over. Colonel Sterling paced behind him like a caged predator. Her perfectly pressed uniform and gleaming eagles on her shoulders represented 15 years of climbing the military hierarchy. She'd fought tooth and nail for this command position, the first woman to lead Fort Braxton's elite training program. Tomorrow's NATO demonstration was supposed to be her crowning achievement. Representatives from 12 allied nations were flying in to witness the F-35's capabilities. Defense contracts worth billions of dollars hung in the balance. Her promotion to general depended on flawless execution. How long for a replacement engine? Sterling demanded. 72 hours minimum, Rodriguez replied without looking up. The demonstration is in 18. Sterling's jaw tightened. Failure wasn't an option. Not when Senator Williams from the Armed Services Committee would be watching. Not when her male colleagues were waiting for her to stumble. That's when she noticed Darius Thompson observing from the maintenance bay's edge. For 3 months, the young recruit had been a thorn in her side. Not because he caused trouble, but because he didn't fit her mental image of what belonged in her elite facility. His Alabama accent, his community college degree, his habit of actually touching equipment instead of relying solely on computers, everything about him screamed doesn't belong here. Sterling had made sure he knew his place. While other recruits with lesser test scores received advanced training assignments, she'd relegated Darius to cleaning duties, inventory management, and grunt work. She'd convinced herself it was about maintaining standards, about preserving the facility's reputation. But deep down, she knew the truth was uglier. "Thompson!" she barked. "What are you doing here?" Darius straightened. "Reporting for evening maintenance duty, ma'am. The adults are working. Find somewhere else to be." "Ma'am, I couldn't help but notice the engine failure pattern." "You couldn't help but notice?" Sterling's voice rose. Several mechanics turned to watch. "Since when do janitors analyze fighter jet engines?" The hangar's atmosphere shifted. Conversations died. Even the constant hum of ventilation systems seemed quiet. Darius had learned to navigate these moments carefully. 3 months of systematic humiliation had taught him when to speak and when to stay silent. But something about this situation felt different. The F-35's failure wasn't just about Sterling's career or the NATO demonstration. Dozens of pilots would eventually fly these jets into combat zones. Lives depended on understanding what went wrong. "I've been studying the maintenance manuals during my off hours," he said quietly. "The acoustic signature before engine failure suggests—" "Acoustic signature?" Sterling stepped closer, her voice dripping with disdain. Did you learn that at your community college auto shop? Several mechanics chuckled nervously. They'd witnessed Sterling's treatment of Darius before, but never this publicly. The young recruit's face remained impassive, but his hands clenched slightly at his sides. Actually, ma'am, I earned my mechanical engineering degree from Alabama AANDM while working 2 jobs to support my family. The admission hung in the air like a challenge. Sterling felt her authority being questioned in front of her subordinates. That couldn't stand. Mechanical engineering? She laughed harshly. From a school I've never heard of. How impressive. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. He'd actually reviewed Darius's file when the recruit first arrived. The kid's aptitude scores were off the charts, especially in diagnostic reasoning, higher than most of the facility's career mechanics. But Sterling wasn't interested in aptitude scores. She saw a young black man who didn't know his place, who had the audacity to speak up when he should stay quiet. Here's what's going to happen, Thompson. You're going to grab a mop and clean the restrooms. Leave the impossible problems to people with real qualifications. Ma'am, with all due respect— Respect? Sterling's voice echoed through the hangar. You want to talk about respect while a billion-dollar demonstration hangs in the balance? She gestured toward the silent F-35. 20 of the military's finest engineers are stumped by this problem, but somehow you think your community college education makes you qualified to solve it? The crowd around them had grown. Word was spreading through the base that something was happening in Hangar 7. Off-duty personnel were finding excuses to walk by. The confrontation was becoming entertainment. Sterling sensed the audience and played to it. Tell you what, Thompson, I'll make you a deal in front of all these witnesses. She raised her voice so everyone could hear. If you can fix this engine, if you can solve what our best people can't, I'll personally recommend you for officer training. Hell, I'll write you a letter of recommendation to MIT myself. The mechanics exchanged glances. This was escalating beyond normal workplace tension, but Sterling wasn't finished. The humiliation had to be complete, public, and memorable. In fact, fix this engine by dawn and I'll marry you myself. I'll even wear my dress blues for the ceremony. The hangar erupted in nervous laughter. Several people pulled out phones to record what they assumed would be the recruit's inevitable backing down. Sterling smiled triumphantly. She'd created a no-win situation. Darius would either refuse the challenge and confirm his place in the hierarchy, or accept it and fail spectacularly in front of everyone. What she didn't expect was the quiet confidence that crossed his face. Darius looked past Sterling to the silent F-35. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. Every engine has its own voice, son. You just have to be quiet enough to hear what it's trying to tell you. He'd been listening to that engine all day, even from across the hangar, and what he'd heard didn't match what the computers were reporting. I accept your challenge, ma'am, Darius said quietly. The laughter died instantly. Sterling's smile faltered for just a moment before returning with renewed viciousness. Excellent! You have until dawn. That gives you about 12 hours to accomplish what's impossible. She turned to address the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, place your bets. Will our janitor solve the mystery of the F-35? What happens next will shock you. This young recruit is about to prove that sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one wearing the most stripes. But first, you need to understand how Darius Thompson became the man who could hear what others couldn't. His story begins in a place where broken engines were just another part of life, and fixing the impossible was a family tradition. The story of Darius Thompson began 40 miles outside Montgomery, Alabama, in a place where broken things weren't thrown away. They were brought back to life. His grandfather, Samuel Big Sam Thompson, had spent World War II as a mechanic with the legendary Tuskegee Airmen. While those brave pilots earned fame for their combat heroics, Big Sam worked in the shadows, keeping P-51 Mustangs flying when spare parts were scarce and prejudice ran deep. After the war, Sam returned to Alabama with calloused hands and a head full of knowledge that no college could teach. He built a small garage behind his farmhouse where neighbors brought their dying tractors, sputtering pickup trucks, and broken dreams wrapped in rust and oil. Darius spent his childhood in that garage, watching his grandfather perform miracles with little more than intuition and determination. While other kids played video games, Darius learned to feel the heartbeat of a Chevy small block, to hear the whispered complaints of a worn transmission. "Come here, boy," Big Sam would say, his weathered hands guiding small fingers to an engine block. "Close your eyes and tell me what you feel." At first, Darius felt nothing but vibration and heat. But gradually, under his grandfather's patient teaching, he began to sense the subtle rhythms that revealed an engine's secrets, a slight irregularity in idle speed that predicted carburetor failure, a barely perceptible knock that meant worn bearings were crying for help. "Every engine has its own voice," Big Sam would explain while they worked side by side in the Alabama heat. "Most folks just hear noise, but if you listen with your heart instead of your ears, you'll hear what it's really trying to say." The lesson extended beyond mechanics. Big Sam had faced prejudice his entire life, from military segregation to civilian discrimination. But he'd learned something that sustained him through decades of being underestimated. "Son, the world's going to tell you what you can't do based on where you come from or what you look like," he'd say while teaching Darius to rebuild a carburetor. But an engine don't care about any of that. It just wants someone who understands its language. Those summer afternoons in the garage became Darius's real education. He learned that mechanical problems were puzzles waiting to be solved, that patience and observation mattered more than fancy equipment, that the simplest solution was usually the right one. When Big Sam's arthritis finally forced him to retire, he passed his tools to Darius with a ceremony as formal as any graduation. The worn wrenches and micrometers had diagnosed thousands of problems, saved countless vehicles from the scrapyard. "These belonged to my daddy before me," Big Sam said, his voice thick with emotion. "He fixed farm equipment during the Depression when folks couldn't afford to buy new. Now they're yours. But the most important inheritance wasn't made of steel. Remember this above everything else," Big Sam continued, gripping Darius's shoulders with hands that still carried the strength of decades. "An engine's trouble always shows in its voice before it shows in the data. Computers can measure, but they can't listen. That's what makes you special." Darius carried that philosophy through high school, where he rebuilt the engine in his '98 Honda Civic not because he had to, but because he wanted to understand every component intimately. His classmates thought he was crazy for choosing an auto shop over computer science, but Darius knew something they didn't. The principles that governed a simple four-cylinder engine were the same ones that powered jet fighters. Physics didn't change just because the stakes got higher. When he earned his mechanical engineering degree from Alabama AANDM, Darius was one of only 3 students who'd actually built an engine from scratch. His professors recognized something rare: a young man who combined theoretical knowledge with practical wisdom. But it was during a summer internship at an aircraft salvage yard that Darius discovered his true calling. The yard specialized in military aircraft, and he spent long days crawling through the remains of retired fighters, learning how advanced engines differed from their automotive cousins. The complexity was breathtaking. Turbofan engines operated on principles that pushed physics to its limits. Temperatures that would melt most metals, pressures that could crush steel, tolerances measured in thousandths of inches. Yet underneath all that sophistication, Darius heard the same basic language his grandfather had taught him to understand. Metal expanding under heat, bearings wearing against their races, air flowing through passages designed by genius and manufactured by craftsmen. One afternoon, while examining a retired F-16 engine that had failed catastrophically, Darius made a discovery that would change his life. The official failure report blamed metal fatigue, but as he listened to the way air moved through the damaged components, he heard a different story. Foreign object debris. A bolt, probably dropped during maintenance, had been ingested into the engine core. The subsequent damage had been misdiagnosed because investigators focused on symptoms rather than causes. His supervisor, a gruff ex-Air Force mechanic named Rodriguez, was skeptical at first. But when they disassembled the engine completely, there it was, a twisted piece of hardware that had triggered a cascade of destruction. "How'd you know?" Rodriguez had asked. "My grandfather taught me that engines always tell the truth," Darius replied. "You just have to know how to listen." That lesson had carried him through basic training, through the challenges of military life, through 3 months of systematic humiliation at Fort Braxton. Now, standing in front of a crowd that expected him to fail, Darius closed his eyes and heard Big Sam's voice one more time. An engine's trouble always shows in its voice before it shows in the data. The F-35's engine had been trying to tell its story all day. Finally, someone was ready to listen. The hangar had transformed into an arena. Word of Sterling's challenge spread through Fort Braxton like wildfire, drawing personnel from every corner of the base. Mechanics abandoned their posts. Administrative staff found excuses to visit Hangar 7. Even the mess hall crew paused dinner prep to witness what promised to be either spectacular failure or impossible miracle. Colonel Sterling stood at the center of it all, feeding off the energy like a predator sensing wounded prey. She'd orchestrated this moment perfectly, a public humiliation so complete that no one would ever question her authority again. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the growing crowd, "we're about to witness something unprecedented. A recruit with a community college degree thinks he can solve what 20 military engineers cannot." Nervous laughter rippled through the assembly. Smartphones appeared, recording what most expected to be a career-ending disaster for the young black recruit who dared to challenge the base commander. Sterling's confidence was absolute. This public challenge would cement the lesson permanently, serving as a warning to anyone else who might consider stepping out of line. But across the hangar, someone else was watching with very different eyes. Chief Master Sergeant Maria Santos had been changing out of her flight suit when word reached the pilot quarters. At 48, she'd spent 25 years in the Air Force, becoming the first Latina to hold the position of senior flight engineer at Fort Braxton. Santos had seen Sterling's treatment of Darius from the beginning. The systematic exclusion from training, the assignment of menial tasks despite exceptional test scores, the casual dismissals that spoke to deeper prejudices. More importantly, Santos recognized something in the young recruit that Sterling had missed entirely. The way he observed aircraft with genuine fascination, the questions that revealed uncommon understanding, the quiet confidence that never wavered despite constant humiliation. Santos pushed through the crowd until she stood near the front, her presence commanding automatic respect. "Colonel Sterling, if I may?" Sterling turned, momentarily thrown off. "Chief Santos, I didn't expect to see you here." "Wouldn't miss it," Santos replied carefully. "Though I have to ask, what's your assessment of the situation, Thompson?" Darius had been quiet through the growing spectacle, using the time to observe and think. Now, with Santos giving him an opening, he spoke carefully. "Ma'am, I've been listening to the engine since the emergency landing. The acoustic signature suggests possible foreign object debris in the core, but the location makes it difficult for standard diagnostics to detect." Rodriguez looked up from his diagnostic station. "What kind of acoustic signature?" "Harmonic distortion in the turbine section. There's a resonance that shouldn't be there, like something's disrupting the airflow pattern." Several mechanics exchanged glances. That was specific technical language, not the vague guessing they'd expected. Sterling felt the crowd's mood shifting and moved quickly to regain control. "Impressive vocabulary, Thompson. Did you memorize that from a manual?" "No, ma'am. I learned it from my grandfather, Samuel Thompson. He maintained P-51 Mustangs with the Tuskegee Airmen." The admission hit Santos like a physical blow. She stepped forward, her voice filled with sudden intensity. "Samuel Thompson? Big Sam from Montgomery?" Darius nodded, surprised by her reaction. "You knew him?" "That man saved my father's life. Sergeant Carlos Santos, 332nd Fighter Group. Your grandfather kept his Mustang flying through missions when everyone said the engine was done for." The hangar fell silent except for the hum of ventilation systems. The connection between past and present suddenly made the moment feel larger than a simple confrontation. Santos continued, her voice carrying the weight of family history. "And my father told me stories about Big Sam until the day he died. Said he could diagnose engine problems by sound alone and find solutions that escaped engineers with fancy degrees." She looked directly at Sterling. "Said he had a grandson who was learning the same gift." Sterling realized she was losing control entirely. What had started as simple public humiliation was becoming something else, something that threatened to expose her own prejudices while elevating Darius to sympathetic status. "This is all very heartwarming," she interrupted sharply, "but we're dealing with reality here. Sentiment doesn't fix fighter jets. You're absolutely right. Santos agreed. So let's test reality. She turned back to Darius. You think you can diagnose this problem? I'd like to try, ma'am, if Colonel Sterling is serious about her offer. All eyes turned back to Sterling. She'd painted herself into a corner with her public challenge, but backing down now would be even more damaging. Oh, I'm completely serious, she said, her voice dripping with false confidence. Fix this engine by dawn and I'll honor every word I said. Officer recommendation, MIT letter, the whole package. She paused for effect, letting her smile turn predatory. But when you fail, and you will fail, I want your transfer request on my desk by noon. This base has no room for people who don't know their limitations. The crowd stirred at the raised stakes. This was no longer about fixing an engine. It was about respect, hierarchy, and the courage to challenge systems that kept people in their assigned places. Sterling stepped closer to Darius, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper that still carried to the crowd. Let me be crystal clear, recruit. You're about to embarrass yourself in front of the entire base. When this is over, you'll be lucky to get assigned to latrine duty at the most remote outpost I can find. She straightened, addressing the crowd again. But hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this janitor really can't accomplish what our $1,000,000 diagnostic equipment cannot. The insult hung in the air like poison. Several mechanics shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that this had moved beyond professional disagreement into something uglier. Darius looked around the hangar at faces that ranged from curious to hostile to hopeful. Then his gaze settled on the silent F-35, its engine cowling open like a patient waiting for surgery. I accept those terms, ma'am, he said quietly. Sterling's smile widened. Excellent. You have 11 hours and 37 minutes until dawn. The clock starts now. She gestured toward the jet like a game show host, revealing a prize. Ladies and gentlemen, let's see if community college engineering can accomplish what the military's finest cannot. The crowd pressed closer as Darius approached the F-35 with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral. He placed his hand on the engine cowling and closed his eyes. For 30 seconds, the hangar was completely silent except for the distant hum of base operations. When Darius opened his eyes, something had changed in his expression. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by quiet determination. Santos watched him with growing respect. She'd seen that look before, in mechanics who possessed something beyond training or education, an intuitive understanding that couldn't be taught in any classroom. Sterling noticed the change, too, and for the first time since issuing her challenge, she felt a flicker of doubt. But it was too late to back down now. Too many people were watching. Too much was at stake. The real test was about to begin. Silence settled over Hangar 7 like a heavy blanket. 43 military personnel watched as Darius Thompson approached the disabled F-35 with movements that seemed almost ceremonial. His worn boots made no sound on the polished concrete as he circled the aircraft, studying it from every angle. Colonel Sterling stood with her arms crossed, confident smile never wavering. She'd given him enough rope to hang himself publicly. Now all she had to do was wait for the inevitable failure. But Chief Santos noticed something the others missed. Darius wasn't rushing to open panels or grab diagnostic equipment. Instead, he was listening. His head tilted slightly, eyes closed, as if hearing something beyond the range of normal perception. What's he doing? Whispered Technical Sergeant Carter. Being dramatic, Sterling replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. Probably trying to figure out how to gracefully back down. Darius ignored the commentary. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. First, you listen. The engine will tell you its story if you're patient enough to hear it. He placed his right hand on the engine cowling, feeling the residual heat through the metal. Then, methodically, he began moving around the aircraft, touching different points, pausing at each to absorb information that instruments couldn't measure. The crowd grew restless. This wasn't what they'd expected. Where were the tools, the diagnostic computers, the frantic activity of someone trying to solve an impossible problem? After 5 minutes of this ritual, Rodriguez finally spoke up. Thompson, you planning to actually work on the engine or just pet it all night? Darius opened his eyes and turned to face the assembled crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried a confidence that made Sterling's smile falter slightly. I need complete silence for the next 10 minutes. No talking, no movement, no electronic devices. The engine needs to tell me what happened during today's flight. This is ridiculous, Sterling snapped. Engines don't talk, recruit. They follow the laws of physics. Yes, ma'am, they do. And physics creates patterns that trained ears can interpret. Santos stepped forward before Sterling could respond. Everyone heard the man. 10 minutes of silence. Anyone who can't manage that can leave now. The authority in her voice was absolute. Conversations died instantly. Smartphones disappeared into pockets. Even the skeptics found themselves holding their breath. Darius approached the F-35's intake and placed his ear against the housing. To the watching crowd, he looked like a doctor using a stethoscope, searching for a heartbeat in a patient who appeared lifeless. For 3 minutes, Darius remained motionless against the engine housing. Then, slowly, he began moving his head to different positions, each time pausing to listen with an intensity that was almost spiritual. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the silent hangar. There's a harmonic distortion in the high-pressure compressor section, frequency approximately 847 Hz with irregular amplitude variations. Rodriguez blinked in surprise. That was impossibly specific information to gather without instruments. Darius continued, his voice growing stronger as confidence built. During normal operation, the F-135 engine produces a consistent acoustic signature, but this engine is singing off-key. Something's disrupting the airflow in the compressor. He pulled out his personal smartphone and opened an acoustic analysis app, the same one he'd used to tune car engines back home. The crowd watched skeptically as he held the device near various points on the engine. Standard F-135 idle resonance should be 834 Hz. He explained, showing the phone's display to Rodriguez. This engine is producing 847 Hz with harmonic spikes up to 863. That's a clear indication of foreign object debris affecting blade dynamics. Rodriguez took the phone, studying the frequency analysis with growing amazement. The readings were consistent, showing exactly the kind of irregular patterns that would indicate internal obstruction. How did you know to look for that specific frequency? Rodriguez asked. My grandfather taught me that every engine family has its own voice, Darius replied. The F-135 shares core design principles with the F-119 from the F-22. I've studied the acoustic signatures of both engines through maintenance documentation. Sterling felt her first real stab of concern. This wasn't the flailing desperation she'd expected. The recruit was demonstrating actual technical knowledge, using methodology that, while unconventional, was producing specific measurable results. Darius moved to the engine's rear section, where the turbine blades caught light from the hangar's fluorescent fixtures. He retrieved a small mirror and flashlight from a nearby tool cart, standard inspection equipment that any mechanic would recognize. The acoustic distortion pattern suggests debris in the high-pressure compressor, but the location of the frequency peak indicates it's not large enough to show on standard FOD inspections. He angled the mirror carefully, directing the flashlight beam into the engine's depths. The watching mechanics craned their necks, trying to see what he was examining. FOD, foreign object debris, usually gets caught in the fan section where it's easily visible, Darius explained as he worked. But microscopic fragments can pass through and lodge in the compressor blades, where they cause harmonic distortion without creating obvious damage. Rodriguez nodded slowly. He'd seen similar cases, though never diagnosed through acoustic analysis. The flight data from today's mission should show a specific pattern, Darius continued, straightening up from his examination. Power fluctuation beginning around 15,000 feet, progressive but subtle, followed by sudden failure at cruise altitude. Santos spoke up from the crowd. Rodriguez, pull up today's flight recorder data. Rodriguez moved to his diagnostic station and began typing commands. Within seconds, the main display screen showed Captain Martinez's flight profile from earlier that day. Jesus, Rodriguez breathed. Power fluctuation starting at 14,800 feet. Gradual degradation over 12 minutes, then catastrophic failure at 22,500 feet. The crowd stirred. Darius had described the failure pattern without accessing any flight data, using only what he'd heard in the engine's acoustic signature. How the hell did you know that? Carter asked, his skepticism beginning to crack. Because the harmonic distortion pattern tells a story, Darius replied. Small debris doesn't cause immediate failure. It creates vibration that gradually worsens as engine stress increases with altitude. The specific frequency I detected indicates fragments small enough to pass initial inspection, but large enough to disrupt compressor efficiency. Sterling watched this exchange with growing alarm. The recruit wasn't just guessing. He was demonstrating diagnostic abilities that exceeded those of her trained mechanics. Darius returned to the engine intake and stood quietly for another minute, processing everything he'd observed. When he turned back to the crowd, his expression had changed from analytical to confident. The debris is lodged in the Stage 3 compressor blades, probably embedded in the leading edge where normal inspection can't detect it. Removing it doesn't require engine teardown or blade replacement. What are you suggesting? Rodriguez asked. Reverse flow purge. We use the engine's own design against the problem. Sterling couldn't stay silent any longer. Reverse flow purge? That's not a standard F-135 procedure. No, ma'am, it's not. But the principle is sound. The F-135 has variable geometry inlet guide vanes and a sophisticated bleed air system. By manipulating inlet airflow and activating specific bleed valves in sequence, we can create a controlled reverse pressure wave through the compressor section. He moved to Rodriguez's diagnostic station and pulled up the engine's technical schematic. Here, if we rotate the inlet guide vanes to minimum flow position while activating the Stage 2 and Stage 4 bleed valves simultaneously, we create a pressure differential that forces air backward through the compressor. Rodriguez studied the schematic, his engineering mind working through the physics. That would create significant reverse flow, but wouldn't it damage the engine? Not if we control the pressure carefully and limit the duration. The debris fragments are small and not mechanically attached. A brief reverse flow pulse should dislodge them without affecting blade integrity. Santos had been following the technical discussion with growing respect. I've seen similar techniques used on F-16s during combat operations. Emergency field procedures when standard maintenance isn't possible. Exactly, Darius nodded. The F-135 is more sophisticated, which means we have better control over the process. Instead of crude reverse thrust maneuvers, we can create precise pressure patterns that target specific compressor stages. He turned to address the entire crowd. The procedure takes about 20 minutes. We program the engine control unit to execute the valve sequence automatically while monitoring pressure and temperature at each stage. If debris dislodges successfully, acoustic signature should return to normal within 5 minutes. Rodriguez was already running calculations on his tablet. Pressure differentials look manageable. Temperature limits stay within acceptable ranges. It's unconventional, but the physics check out. Sterling felt control slipping away entirely. What had started as a simple humiliation was becoming a technical masterclass that exposed her own limitations while showcasing abilities she'd refused to acknowledge. This is theoretical nonsense, she declared loudly. You can't fix a $30 million engine with acoustic analysis and folk wisdom. Santos stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of 25 years' experience. Actually, Colonel, some of our most effective combat maintenance techniques came from exactly this kind of innovative thinking. Sometimes unconventional solutions work when standard procedures fail. She looked directly at Darius. I've seen enough. This young man understands engine dynamics better than most career mechanics. His methodology is sound, his reasoning is logical, and his diagnostic accuracy has been proven by flight data correlation. The crowd murmured agreement. Even the skeptics had been impressed by Darius's systematic approach and technical precision. The question now, Santos continued, is whether we're going to let pride prevent us from trying a solution that might actually work. All eyes turned to Sterling. She was trapped between her public challenge and her private fears, between maintaining authority and admitting she'd underestimated someone based on prejudice rather than capability. The next few minutes would determine not just whether an engine got fixed, but whether justice finally had its day at Fort Braxton. The hangar fell silent except for the hum of diagnostic equipment as Darius approached the F-35's control interface. Every person present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, a moment that would either validate revolutionary thinking or end a young man's military career. Colonel Sterling stood rigid, her jaw clenched tight. She'd painted herself into an impossible corner. Allowing this procedure meant risking a $30 million aircraft on theories from someone she'd dismissed as unqualified. Chief Santos positioned herself where she could monitor both engine parameters and Sterling's reactions. 25 years of military service had taught her to recognize pivotal moments. "Rodriguez," Darius said quietly, "I'll need you to monitor compressor temperatures while I program the valve sequence. If we see readings above normal limits, we abort immediately." Rodriguez nodded, his initial skepticism replaced by professional curiosity. The recruit's technical knowledge had proven legitimate. Now they'd discover whether his unconventional solution could work in practice. Darius connected his tablet to the engine's maintenance interface, fingers moving across the screen with practiced precision. Lines of code appeared, programming the complex sequence of valve operations that would create the reverse flow pulse. "Stage 2 bleed valve programmed for 3.2-second activation," he announced. "Stage 4 bleed valve set for 2.8-second overlap. Inlet guide vanes rotating to minimum flow position." "Temperature sensors are active," Rodriguez confirmed. "Pressure monitoring online. All systems ready." The crowd pressed closer, smartphones capturing every moment. This footage would either document a breakthrough or spectacular failure. Darius paused with his finger over the execution command. His grandfather's voice whispered in memory. "Trust what the engine tells you, son. It never lies." "Beginning reverse flow purge sequence," he announced. The F-35's engine control unit came alive with electronic chirps as valve actuators responded to programmed commands. Deep within the engine, pressurized air began flowing in directions it was never designed to travel. On Rodriguez's monitoring screen, pressure readings fluctuated as the orchestrated sequence unfolded. Stage 2 bleed valve opened with a sharp hiss, followed by Stage 4. Air that normally flowed front to rear suddenly reversed course, creating powerful pressure waves moving backward through the compressor section. "Pressure spike in compressor section," Rodriguez called out, "still within acceptable limits." The sound was unlike anything the mechanics had heard. Instead of normal whoosh of air flowing through turbine blades, the engine produced deep, rhythmic pulsing as artificial pressure waves moved against natural airflow patterns. "Temperature rising but stable," Rodriguez reported. "Compressor vibration showing, wait." He leaned closer to instruments, watching readouts that seemed almost too good to be true. "Vibration frequency is changing, dropping from 847 Hz toward normal range." The crowd stirred. Even without technical training, they could hear the difference. The engine's acoustic signature was shifting, the off-key resonance gradually harmonizing into something healthier. "Debris displacement confirmed," Rodriguez announced, excitement creeping into his voice. "Frequency now at 841 Hz and stabilizing." Darius monitored the procedure with intense concentration, ready to abort if any parameter moved toward dangerous territory. But the F-135's sophisticated control systems were handling unconventional demands exactly as calculated. "Final pressure pulse," he announced. 3, 2, 1, mark. The last valve sequence activated with precision timing. A final rush of reverse airflow swept through the compressor section, carrying away microscopic fragments that had caused catastrophic failure hours earlier. Then, suddenly, silence. The engine sat motionless, internal systems cycling back to normal configurations. Inlet guide vanes rotated to standard positions. Bleed valves closed with soft mechanical clicks. Status lights on Rodriguez's panel shifted from amber warnings to steady green. "All parameters normal," Rodriguez announced, wondering, filling his voice. "Acoustic signature showing 834 Hz perfect F-135 specification." Santos stepped forward, her expression mixing professional respect with amazement. "Outstanding work, Thompson. Now let's see if she'll start." This was the ultimate test. Theoretical success meant nothing if the engine refused to operate. Darius had eliminated suspected debris, but dozens of other factors could prevent startup after such unconventional procedure. He moved to the engine control panel and placed his hand on the startup switch. Around him, 43 people held their breath. "Engine start sequence initiated," he announced. The F-135 turbofan began its startup cycle with electronic precision, igniters sparked, fuel injectors activated. The massive turbine assembly began rotating slowly, gathering momentum as sophisticated computers orchestrated thousands of synchronized operations. The sound that emerged was pure mechanical poetry. Gone was the harsh vibration that had preceded failure. In its place, the engine produced a smooth, powerful roar that represented 30 years of engineering excellence operating exactly as designed. Compressor stages spun up to operational speed without hesitation. Turbine temperatures climbed steadily within normal parameters. Oil pressure stabilized at specification levels. "Full military power achieved," Rodriguez announced over the engine's thunderous voice. "All systems are nominal. Engine operating within perfect parameters." The hangar erupted in cheers. Mechanics who'd spent hours baffled by the failure now watched in amazement as their most sophisticated aircraft hummed with flawless operation. But the loudest sound was silence from Colonel Sterling, whose face had gone pale as she realized what had occurred. A recruit she'd dismissed and humiliated had accomplished what her entire team could not. The moment of truth had arrived, and it belonged entirely to Darius Thompson. The thunderous roar of the perfectly functioning F-35 engine gradually subsided as Darius shut down the system. In the sudden quiet, 43 people stood in stunned silence, processing what they'd witnessed. Chief Santos was the first to move. She strode across the hangar with purposeful steps, approaching Darius without hesitation. "Thompson, that was exceptional work. In 25 years, I've never seen diagnostic intuition like that." The handshake broke the spell. The hangar erupted in applause. Mechanics who'd been skeptical hours earlier now crowded around Darius, offering congratulations and asking technical questions. Rodriguez pushed through the crowd, his face beaming. "Kid, you just saved the Air Force millions and probably prevented future accidents. That debris could have caused failures in other aircraft." All eyes eventually turned to Colonel Sterling, who stood frozen near the F-35's wing. Her carefully constructed world of hierarchies had just collapsed. The recruit she'd publicly humiliated had solved a problem that stumped her best people. Santos approached Sterling directly, her voice carrying command authority. "Colonel, I believe you made certain promises to this young man." Sterling's mouth opened without sound. The marriage joke that had seemed clever hours earlier now felt like a noose. Every word had been recorded on smartphones. She began, then stopped. Darius stepped forward, saving her from further embarrassment. "Ma'am, I'm not interested in the marriage proposal, but I would appreciate the officer training recommendation and opportunity to apply my skills where needed." Santos nodded approvingly. "Thompson, I'm personally recommending you for immediate entry into the warrant officer program, specialization in advanced aircraft diagnostics." She pulled out her phone and began typing. "I'm also sending your reverse flow procedure to Pentagon Engineering for evaluation. This technique could revolutionize field maintenance across the entire fleet." The crowd murmured approval. Word was spreading beyond the hangar. By morning, Darius Thompson's name would be known throughout Fort Braxton and beyond. "Additionally," Santos continued, "I want you as co-instructor for the new diagnostic training program we're developing. Your grandfather's wisdom combined with modern engineering could train the next generation." Sterling watched her authority crumble as Santos effectively took control. The base that had been hers to command was slipping away. The moment of recognition had arrived, and with it, the beginning of justice. 3 weeks later, the consequences of that night in Hangar 7 began rippling through Fort Braxton like aftershocks from an earthquake. Colonel Sterling sat in her newly assigned office, a cramped space in the administrative building's basement, far from the aircraft hangars where real decisions were made. Her desk faced a concrete wall instead of the runway views she'd once commanded. The investigation had been swift and thorough. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had finally found his courage, submitting a formal complaint detailing months of discriminatory behavior. Other personnel followed, sharing stories of qualified minorities being passed over for advancement, while less capable candidates received opportunities. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage showed Sterling consistently assigning menial tasks to Darius despite his exceptional test scores. Email records revealed her blocking his applications for advanced training programs. Her own words during the engine challenge had been recorded by dozens of smartphones. "Colonel Sterling," her replacement announced from the doorway. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, a decorated pilot with an engineering background, had taken command of the F-35 program. "Your new assignment papers." Sterling accepted the folder with hands that trembled slightly. Inside, she found orders transferring her to Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Alaska, a weather monitoring station where her duties would involve tracking storm patterns and filing meteorological reports. "Alaska?" she whispered. "The Pentagon felt a change of climate might help you reflect on leadership principles," Morrison replied, without emotion. "Your transport leaves at 0600 tomorrow." The irony wasn't lost on anyone at Fort Braxton. The woman who'd wielded the threat of remote assignments as punishment was now experiencing that fate herself. Meanwhile, Darius Thompson's life had transformed completely. His warrant officer commission had been expedited through Pentagon channels, fast-tracking him past years of typical bureaucracy. The reverse flow diagnostic technique he'd pioneered was being implemented across all F-35 squadrons, with mandatory training for maintenance crews. But the most satisfying change was cultural. New protocols required technical competency testing for all supervisory positions. Educational background remained important, but practical problem-solving abilities carried equal weight. Community college graduates could no longer be dismissed simply because their degrees lacked Ivy League prestige. A diversity task force, led by Chief Santos, began reviewing personnel files to identify other talented individuals who'd been overlooked due to prejudice. 3 mechanics received immediate promotions. 2 recruits were fast-tracked into officer programs. The Darius Protocol, as base personnel had dubbed the new evaluation system, emphasized mentorship over hierarchy, collaboration over competition. Sterling's former subordinates adapted quickly to the new environment. Rodriguez found himself working directly with Darius on advanced diagnostic procedures, their partnership producing maintenance innovations that impressed Pentagon officials. Technical Sergeant Carter, who'd once laughed at Sterling's humiliation tactics, now volunteered to help implement diversity training across the base. "I was part of the problem," she admitted during one session, "but I want to be part of the solution." The NATO demonstration had proceeded flawlessly 3 weeks earlier, with Darius presenting his diagnostic methodology to international defense officials. Orders for F-35 aircraft increased by 30%, as allies gained confidence in the improved maintenance protocols. Senator Williams, initially skeptical about the unorthodox events at Fort Braxton, became an advocate for promoting innovative thinking within military ranks. The base received additional funding for advanced training programs. Sterling's career wasn't destroyed, but it was permanently diminished. Her personnel file now contained formal reprimands that would prevent future promotions. The general's stars she'd pursued so aggressively would remain forever out of reach. Justice at Fort Braxton didn't require vindictive punishment. The natural consequences of Sterling's actions, loss of respect, career stagnation, professional exile, provided appropriate accountability. Most importantly, systemic changes ensured her discriminatory practices couldn't continue. Future recruits would be evaluated on merit rather than prejudice, potential rather than pedigree. The base had learned that true leadership meant recognizing talent wherever it emerged, not suppressing it when it challenged comfortable assumptions. Sterling's Alaska assignment would begin at dawn, but her legacy of discrimination was already ending. 6 months later, Warrant Officer Darius Thompson stood before a classroom of diverse recruits at the Air Force Academy, teaching the diagnostic principles his grandfather had passed down in an Alabama barn. The Thompson method was now standard protocol across NATO air forces. 12 aircraft failures had been prevented using acoustic analysis techniques that combined traditional wisdom with modern technology. Sterling had adapted to her new reality monitoring weather patterns in Alaska, far from the aircraft she'd once commanded. Her story served as a cautionary tale throughout military leadership training. But Darius's greatest pride came from a letter in his quarters, a handwritten note from Big Sam's nursing home, where his grandfather watched news coverage of his success with tears of joy. "Every engine has its own voice," the letter concluded. "But you, grandson, you gave voice to something much more important. You spoke for everyone who's been told they don't belong. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the most powerful truths. If you were in Darius's position, would you have had the courage to accept Sterling's impossible challenge? There's a detail at minute 4:23 that only sharp-eyed viewers will catch. Watch again and see if you spot it. Subscribe if you believe talent deserves recognition, regardless of where it comes from, and share this story with someone who needs to hear that their potential matters. #justice for underestimated #military justice #talent recognition.